Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another insightful episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and we have a very special guest today who I'll get to in a second. But we are, of course, joined today by the wise, venerable, and stalwart of the show, Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you?
That's a wonderful introduction, Nicholas. I'm doing okay.
Excellent. I think appearing for the first time on the show is Head of Policy Research at the IRR, Dr. Anthea Jeffery. Anthea, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Right. So today, we're taking advantage of the fact that Anthea is joining us. And of course, we've also got Terence, who's also well-versed in these matters, to talk about where the expropriation without compensation drive currently sits. There are some important developments that people should be aware of, and we're just going to explore those issues a little bit more. So, Anthea, you have written or in the process of writing an article, which I believe should be up either today or tomorrow, I think, on possibly the Daily Friend and in various other places, about some problems with the expropriation without compensation is currently sort of going through the parliamentary process. So my first question to you, Anthea, is just, could you just clarify for our listeners the difference between the constitutional amendment on EWC and the expropriation bill? Because I think there's a little bit of confusion about these two things.
Sure. So we have two parliamentary committees dealing with these two bills. In terms of the constitutional amendment bill, it's an ad hoc committee that was established by Parliament that at the beginning of this year had a deadline of the 31st of March to adopt a bill that would then go to Parliament for formal enactment. And then we also have the expropriation bill, which is being handled by the Portfolio Committee on Public Works and Infrastructure. And both of those committees have set in motion public participation processes, which is what the Constitution requires them to do. Formally, the wording is that they have to facilitate public involvement in the legislative process. And committees do that generally by asking for written submissions. And then from the people who've sent in written submissions, they select those who've also asked to make oral presentations. And they give them the opportunity to come before the committee and elaborate on what they've said and answer questions that the committee might have. So this is the key mechanisms that the public have to make their views known. And it's therefore very important that the committee should take seriously the written submissions that they receive and then provide a fair and equitable opportunity to people to make oral presentations. And on both these committees are falling down. The ad hoc committee received, we now know, 204,000 written submissions before the end of February 2020, last year, just before the lockdown, which it then hardly processed because of the lockdown. This year it started again, and it needs to hold oral hearings, invite oral presentations. Its first response was no, it wouldn't at all, because that would get in the way of the March deadline. Its second was to say, well, all right, we will allow written submission, oral presentations, but only if they don't exceed the 3 days that we've set aside for this process. So if there are far more people who've asked to make oral presentations than can be accommodated, the implication is that they're simply going to cut some of the people out of the process. And on the expropriation bill, we have a similar phenomenon with the Portfolio Committee. It received 90,000 written submissions before the deadline of last month, the 28th of February 2021. And it cannot possibly have read all those submissions in the last 2 weeks or so. And yet it is forging ahead with a hearing of oral presentations next week. And it doesn't really know who asked to make oral presentations. So there's an entirely unfair and arbitrary process that's going on at the moment, in terms of which that committee is inviting certain people to make oral presentations and quite likely leaving out a large swathe of organizations that did want to make oral presentations too, that have important points to make about the economic damage from EWC and so on, that need really the opportunity to explain to the committee just how serious an EWC approach is.
So, Terence, let me go to you. There's an argument that I see kind of a lot of people make when they hear, all these this conversation about process, when they hear all this conversation about law, and they say, what's the point of doing oral written submissions to Parliament on these issues? Because the ANC is just going to do exactly what it always wanted to do. It's just going to ignore all of the submissions except the ones it likes. Why should anyone participate in this process at all?
Well, because it is an opportunity to influence, and just because the process or track record of this may be imperfect does not mean that citizens should give up the opportunities that they have. This also goes to the constitutionality of the process, the right of people in South Africa to have an input into legislation or into policy, to have their voices heard. That is one that has actually come before the Constitutional Court, and they've fallen. They've come down unambiguously on the side of that right. This is a right. This is a right that South African citizens have, and it's not one that they should surrender. If for no other reason, to be heard for posterity, to say that not that even if this particularly pathological basket of policies is put through, to be able to say in 10 years' time that there were some people who warned of this, and although that is obviously a suboptimal situation, to be able to say, well, now maybe we can actually start talking about these things reasonably, like mature citizens of a constitutional democracy.
Right. I think that's a very important point. There is political effect to having made these arguments if the policy turns out to fail, which, as we know, it will. I think you also raised an important issue here, which is that, of course, this is not only is EWC a huge attack on the Bill of Rights and the right to own property, which is in the Constitution already, but by rushing the process, they're undermining another right, which is the right to have input on the legislative process. Anthea, anything to add on this point before we perhaps move on?
Yes, I think, as Terence is indicating, there have been successful challenges to the Constitutional Court where people have made submissions and these submissions haven't been taken adequately into account. It has been possible on a number of occasions to have legislation struck down for this procedural defect. The last version of the Expropriation Bill, for example, was in the end sent back by President Zuma, who was then our president, to Parliament because the whole process of hearing and dealing with submissions had not been adequately, properly done. So you can, at the very least, secure a delay. You can also, one hopes, provide more ammunition for people who are trying to oppose the bill to use in persuading Parliament not to do something that's going to be enormously damaging to all South Africans, and particularly the poor. And you can have the hope of having some laws where the public consultation process has been particularly flawed, to have that bill struck down. Right.
I also just, Anthea, want to go into this issue a little bit more deeply with regards to the difference between the constitutional amendment and the EWC bill. So, based off of your understanding, without the amendment, would the bill be able to go forward? What's the thinking, the sort of legal thinking in that area? Is the constitutional amendment required to be done first, and then they can do the bill?
I think there certainly, from the ANC's point of view, is an advantage in having both, because the constitutional amendment bill will weaken the property rights that people already have by saying that it may be just and equitable for nil compensation to be paid. And it will also say that Parliament will decide in what circumstances it may be just and equitable to have zero compensation. So the expropriation bill, with its nil compensation provisions, would be one such statute which Parliament will adopt by an ordinary majority, and then it will say that in this situation, it may be just to have nothing paid at all. So you do really need the two to work in combination. I think if the constitutional amendment bill was not passed, the ANC could still do a lot of damage just under the rubric of the expropriation bill, partly because it argues that the Constitution already allows zero compensation as just and equitable in some circumstances, and partly because a real purpose of the expropriation bill, one of its key functions, is to so narrow the definition of expropriation that many takings by the state wouldn't count as an expropriation at all, so there would be no compensation, and the supposed procedural safeguards on expropriation would also fall away, because it's a different kind of taking that's envisaged. And the particular example there is a custodial taking. The government would argue that if you define expropriation narrowly as the compulsory acquisition of land and other property, then if the government takes custodianship of land, it's not acquiring it, it's simply becoming its custodian, and therefore there's no expropriation and there's no need to pay compensation. So that can stand possibly even without the compensation, even without the constitutional amendment bill. But the two in combination would be that much stronger from an NDR, an ideological perspective of empowering the state.
Right, and I think there's also political and psychological consequences from changing the constitution, which are quite significant, particularly in this sphere.
Yes, indeed,
so,
and possibly a precedent to be established. If you can change the constitution in one context, then you can start changing it in others as well.
Right, I think there was an argument made by the American founding fathers in the Federalist Papers that by having this great document that was very difficult to change, you would kind of instill a value that in the document itself would become almost sacred, and that would help to protect the rights that it enshrined. And so the more you change it, the less value it becomes, because it just becomes then a sort of expedient procedural thing to be overcome. Terence, do you have anything to add on this point?
Indeed.
Well, look, on that point, I think it's important to bear in mind that since the 1990s, there have been voices at varying intensities and various levels of audibility coming from within the ANC that have regarded the property clause as a sort of special case, a sunset provision, as one put it, that would ultimately be snuffed out. But one doesn't have to go to Philadelphia in the 1700s. One can go to a webinar I attended at UFS a couple of weeks ago, where one of the chair asked why has the constitutional the constitutional precedent received such little attention. What starts with a property clause may well not end with a property clause.
Right.
You can see a situation where we want not a free press but a responsible press. So we could fiddle with free speech. After all, we've done this before. When we brought in our new look property clause. Or we worried about disorder. So how about reasonable rights to assemble as opposed to freedom of assembly, etc., etc., etc. Be very, very careful about what doors you open, because strange things can walk through them.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. So, Anthea, one of the things that might be said in defense of Parliament here, and defenders of the EWC process here, they'll say, look, as you point out, there's so many there's this enormous number of written submissions, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. And we don't know, maybe 10% of them want to do oral submissions. Who should be allowed to make an oral submission? We can't expect Parliament to be filled just with people making oral submissions for years and years and years. By drawing up whatever list Parliament has managed to draw up is the most efficient and effective way of making sure that the legislative process can continue while still being able to hear some of these oral presentations. So what's the standard here for how many of these oral presentations should be heard as part of the discussion?
I think the principle is what matters, and the principle that's been established so far is that people who make written submissions and say that they would also like the opportunity to make oral presentations have thus far been given the opportunity to make those oral presentations. So there seems no reason to depart from that principle. And the risk that you also generate is that you'll get a very carefully selected group of people who are chosen to make oral presentations. And we can see it already on the expropriation bill, that the rather arbitrary list of people, there are 21 that have been invited to come and speak to the portfolio committee, seems to have been geared really towards giving more of a hearing to people within the ANC alliance, to people who are in favor of the expropriation bill. And that, of course, will leave out of account the very large number of considerations against it, all the economic damage it's likely to do, the extent to which Black people who were deprived of property rights in the apartheid era are likely to find themselves deprived of property rights again. Important social considerations too. If you have a choice of people to make oral presentations geared towards those who favor what the ANC wants, then you really are shortchanging everybody else. It's an irrational and unfair process that leaves out some, brings in others, with no principle to guide it.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. There's no limiting principle here. So I think one of the other things that you've talked about, Anthea, is the need for a comprehensive socio-economic assessment on these changes to law and the constitution. And this is something I've come across in local government before. A lot of pieces of legislation, they require various studies to be done as to what the impact of this would be. So, for example, if you're going to build something, you're required to do an environmental impact assessment on it in a lot of circumstances. What exactly do you mean by a comprehensive socioeconomic assessment, and what would that look like?
In terms of government policy, as adopted in 2015, every new bill is supposed to be accompanied by a very comprehensive socioeconomic assessment process, which begins right at the start with an analysis of what are the different options that we could use to reach the desired goal, what are the costs and consequences of each one, and that is supposed to then fine-tune the choice so that you end at initial stage with the best of the possible options, say to make more of a success of land reform. And then once you've identified the best possible option, then you should have a really informed evaluation of what the economic and social consequences are likely to be, and in particular on whether there's anything in the bill that could jeopardize tax revenues, that could prompt immigration, that could make it more difficult for the economy to grow. These are all identified as factors that are very relevant to be taken into account in a socioeconomic assessment. And by the time a bill is presented for public comment, it's supposed to have the final version of the socioeconomic assessment attached to it to help people know all about the issues that are raised by the bill. And this is what the Constitutional Court has also said, that people must have a real opportunity to know about the issues raised by the bill. And a proper CS report is the best way of providing that knowledge to people. But the expropriation bill was provided without any kind of final CS assessment. It does try and talk about the financial ramifications and just talks about some extra costs to the bureaucracy. They might need more people for certain reporting purposes, but nothing about the wider costs to the economy and to South Africans and to the 9.7 or so million Black South Africans who own homes, for instance, who might find their home ownership at risk. And the same with the Constitutional Amendment Bill, where it was even more necessary to have a proper CS assessment, and yet it hasn't been done.
Right. So Terence, defenders of the bill will often say, well, this bill is going to lift up the unlanded masses and give them economic access to the economy as a whole, and will right the wrongs of the past. Is the government sincere when it says that? Because you'd think then that they would be very happy to have an economic assessment done to determine whether, because obviously if they're right, an economic assessment would show that they're going to be right. What do you make of that, Terence?
Well, the government policy in South Africa for the better part of 20 years has supposedly been informed by this idea of evidence-based policy making. You see this phrase very strongly, for instance, in the National Development Plan. But I think that this is a wonderful example of when a country writes ideological checks that its economy just can't cash. Sorry, it's a bit of an appropriation from the original Top Gun. This strikes at the heart of the prospects for South Africa's future. I mean, just look at the numbers. 10 million people who need jobs. We've come through the worst economic contraction in South Africa's history. I mean, you have to go back to the Boer War to find something like the effect COVID had, and that came on top of 2 years of really meager growth. I mean, if you can call 0.2% GDP expansion growth, and behind that there's all the human stories. We need to get this country working. We need to get an environment where entrepreneurs, large and small, are willing to invest. I don't just mean people from Boston and Beijing. I mean, people from Benoni, making South Africa an attractive place for South Africans to do business. So something that hits at property rights, which is the core of a successful economy, is that it needs to be taken very, very, very carefully. It needs to be meticulously unpacked what you intend to do with this thing. Vague professions about reversing historical wrongs and that sort of thing don't really cut the mustard. Good intentions, assuming your intentions are good, don't necessarily add up to good policy. It's entertaining for me to see that the Chinese Communist Party, which the ANC once identified it as the ideological lodestar, and I have very serious problems with the Chinese Communist Party, as we've often discussed on the show, but they're moving in the opposite direction. While it's being speculated here that maybe we could take all land into custodianship, and then this omniscient state will parcel it out on the basis of fairness and production discipline, overseen by a bureaucracy that's never grown so much as a daisy in a pot plant before. The Chinese are actually looking at how they can encourage their farmers to grow more, and one of the things there is expanding ownership, making their tenure more secure. Now they're not onto proper land ownership yet, but the direction of play in the two countries is very different. And Anthea's quite correct. In the past, black people were denied ownership rights that white people, and to some extent, Indian and colored counterparts had, and this just seems to be the way that things will carry on. Brian Pottinger wrote in the Mbeki Legacy about the ANC's approach to this. Whereas the apartheid government said, "Don't worry about your future, you don't have one," the ANC seems to say, "Well, don't worry about your future, we will give it to you." After the shenanigans we've seen in the past year, I can imagine there's many South Africans across the board who would not take comfort in that sort of approach to their lives. And the other interesting thing is that there's been a fair amount of evidence, both hard and circumstantial, that land reform beneficiaries assume that land ownership is part of the deal. And I'm not sure just how widely understood it is that this is not policy at all. Policy is state ownership, and this legislation, along with the constitutional amendment, is likely to solidify that, into the sticky swamp that is government venality and incompetence.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have a difficult time assuming good intentions even here, because EWC will reduce the number of black landowners with actual title to land or property of any kind, with secure title to zero, because everyone will be a tenant of the state. Anthea, anything to add before we move on to what the next steps might be?
Nothing comes to mind right now, Nicholas.
Okay, right. So let me then ask that question of you, Anthea. This process is going ahead. They're going to hear some written submissions. Hopefully, they will expand the list substantially based on our criticisms here. But regardless of whether they do or do not, what's the next step after the oral submissions are given to Parliament on these various legislative measures?
Well, just to clarify, what we are doing now is to write to the Secretary of the committee, the Portfolio Committee dealing with the Expropriation Bill, to say that it really isn't acceptable to have this arbitrary and unfair process for selecting the oral presentations. And it also isn't acceptable to be forging ahead with oral presentations at a point where the committee has quite clearly not got to grips with 90,000 written submissions. And its obligation is to get to grips with what South Africans have told it as part of facilitating public involvement in the legislative process. So we are urging that the committee go back to the drawing board, that we have a proper public consultation process, that it begins with a CS assessment, that if they are still going to proceed with an expropriation bill, then the final CS report setting out all the costs and consequences in a realistic way must be appended to that bill, so that people can then know about the issues and draw up informed submissions, which are then properly taken into account by a committee, which is no longer ideologically determined just to press ahead with EWC, but is really willing to entertain what ordinary South Africans say. And we think the same needs to be done in relation to the ad hoc committee and the constitutional amendment bill, because again, though they are now saying they'll try and find out whoever it was that asked to make an oral presentation, at the end of the day, if there are only 3 days set aside for that process, and they regard the deadline as the most important thing, then they're going to drop a lot of the people who wanted to be able to speak to them. And again, their process has been flawed from the start. So we're going to again ask that we go back to the beginning. We have a great reset in terms of public participation, and we do it properly from the start and give South Africans the chance to know the risks, make their voices heard, and put pressure on the committee to heed those voices instead of disregarding them. And of course, there is also the possibility that if the committees just press on regardless, that what they've done is contrary to the Constitution and can help to found litigation to set it aside in due course.
Right, that was exactly going to be my next question. So if the committee doesn't take us seriously on the request to do the process properly, then they may be opening themselves up to serious challenges. Terence, where do you see the next phase of the EWC battle sort of going with regards here? Is this going to be resolved in the courts going forward, or what's your view?
Well, I think I can speak better to tone than to direction. We believe that we have shown that this legislation holds existential dangers for South Africa. The law as it exists is deeply problematic, and it's being placed in the hands of a state that has not shown itself to be a model of efficiency, proficiency, or integrity. So expect this not to end well. But the good news is that we at the IRR are not going to take this lying down, and we will contest this every step of the way. If this goes through, then yes, we will look at we will look at other potential avenues, and we've been around since 1929. There were realities that looked unchangeable and insurmountable back in those days, and today they are part of the edifice of history. A lot of people talk about the long game. Amateurs. We've been in the long game. So yeah, we are here, and we are resolved to fight it, and to fight for a legal order and a property rights order that makes sense, that doesn't enable redress and sensible redistribution, while growing the size of the economy and the opportunities that come with it.
Exactly. Anthea, any closing thoughts in the last sort of 30 seconds or so?
Yes, indeed. Perhaps it's just worth mentioning that Albie Sachs, in addressing the ad hoc committee, did explain why we have a property clause in the Constitution. And he did emphasize that it was because of the injustices of the past and the way in which Black people were barred from property ownership. And he said, as that changes, we want to make sure that they can't be deprived of property ownership in the future. And that was then, and this is the ANC now, but we need to be really very careful of safeguarding the future of all South Africans. We have had a remarkable expansion in property ownership among Black South Africans since all the apartheid restrictions began to crumble in the 1970s and the 1980s. That's something to be applauded. But many of those people still need secure title to land. That should be our absolute focus, making sure that they have title deeds which are respected by all, rather than putting all South Africans at risk of having their property rights, not only to land, but to assets of all other kinds, taken by an incompetent, venal and corrupt government.
Exactly. It's often said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it seems that the ANC is very keen on making that come true. And we will continue to fight it every step of the way. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much to my guests for coming on and giving us their insight and wisdom. And we will see you tomorrow on the next episode of the Daily Friend Show. Have a good day, everyone.